Welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today, we're going to be exploring this whole world of developmental language disorders, or as we call them, DLD.
Right.
Now, we've got a whole bunch of research piled up here.
Yes.
Expert analyses, case studies, all that good stuff. And we're going to really try to figure out, how is DLD classified?
Yeah.
What causes it?
Yeah.
And how it impacts learning.
Right.
So whether you're out there, supporting someone with DLD, working in education, or just, curious about how this whole language thing develops in our brains.
Yeah.
This is the deep dive for you.
It's fascinating, going beyond just the typical speech problems
Right.
and really getting into this whole complex world of how the brain actually learns language.
Yeah. So, okay, first things first, we got to clear up what DLD actually is.
Right.
Right. Because you hear all these terms thrown around, speech delays, language problems, where does DLD fit into all this?
Yeah, well, DLD, it's not just about how you pronounce things.
Right.
It's, all these challenges that impact how a child understands, uses, and learns language.
Yeah.
The whole system, from sounds to grammar to even social situations.
So it's really the whole enchilada.
It is.
And it's really interesting, like you were saying, that it's not always clear what causes it. Right?
Yeah, it's not like you can just point to one gene
right, exactly.
or one thing in the environment. It's complicated.
It's more like, one of those puzzles with a million pieces.
Yeah, and they all kind of fit together.
Exactly.
You've got the biology piece, right? Genetics, brain structure, then you've got these health factors, and then the environment.
Right, so it's all these things interweaving.
It all mixes together.
Which makes you think about, how often we hear about early intervention being so important.
Oh, absolutely.
With kids who have DLD.
Yeah.
If it's this complex, why are those, first few years so crucial?
Well, your brain is developing so rapidly, especially when it comes to language in those first few years. It's
Right.
Imagine a little sponge, just soaking up everything, making all these connections.
Right.
And during that time, it's super adaptable, or as we say in the field, plastic.
Okay.
So intervention can really make a difference.
So it's like you can kind of shape those pathways.
Exactly.
Wow.
And that's why it's so important to get in there early, identify any issues and start supporting those kids right away.
So if you can, identify it and support those kids early on, you're basically giving their brains the best chance to build that strong language foundation.
Absolutely. That's the goal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And to do that, you got to know the early signs.
Right. What are we looking for?
Well, things like, if they're not making much eye contact,
okay,
or having trouble responding to sounds, or maybe struggling to understand simple gestures.
Yeah.
Even those could be early signs. And the earlier we catch it, the better.
The better the outcome for the kid, right?
Exactly.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's zoom in on this specific type of DLD called specific language impairment. Or, as all the cool kids call it, SLI.
That's the one.
How is that different from this big umbrella term, DLD?
So think of it this way. SLI is kind of like a subset of DLD.
Okay.
Where it's really the language impairment that's the main challenge.
Okay.
And there's not another obvious explanation, like a hearing loss or they have a low IQ. It's not that.
So it's not like a general cognitive thing?
Exactly. Their language skills are just significantly below their overall cognitive abilities.
So they're bright, they're intelligent, but it's this specific area of the language that's lagging behind.
And that's actually where things get a little complicated.
Okay, how so?
Well, how do you actually diagnose SLI?
Right, how do you measure that?
In the past, it was all about comparing IQ to language skills. What we call the discrepancy criteria, that's changing.
Well, and that's actually something that Tomlin, in his research, really gets into.
Yes, he does.
What do they find?
Well, Tomlin's research suggests that maybe instead of focusing on this IQ discrepancy, we should really just focus on the language skills themselves.
Okay.
As a more effective way to identify those kids who truly need support.
So you're kind of taking the IQ out of the equation.
Yeah, it's almost like you're comparing apples and oranges, right? And we should really just be focusing on the apples.
Focus on the language.
Yeah, and they found that if you define SLI as language skills that are 1.148 standard deviations below average, even if a child has average or above average IQ, you're catching more kids who are struggling.
It's a more accurate picture.
And it avoids overlooking those kids who might not fit the mold, so to speak.
The traditional model.
Exactly.
Okay, so SLI, we've established it's complex.
Very much so.
How do researchers even go about classifying it?
You know, it's tough.
Yeah.
You have this incredibly diverse group of children, and SLI can show up in so many different ways.
Right, it's not just one thing.
Some might struggle with sentences, others have trouble with vocabulary, some have social communication issues.
Right.
It's all over the map.
It really is. And looking through our sources, researchers are using all sorts of approaches, like cluster analysis, where they look for patterns and language skills. They use clinical observation. Some even combine these different methods. But it seems like finding that perfect system, it's still out there.
Yeah, there's no magic bullet yet.
Right, exactly.
You know, you have systems like the one developed by Rapin and Allen that tries to break down SLI into different subtypes based on a kid's language. But even that has limitations, right? Well, Conti Ramsden and some other researchers have pointed out that kids can actually move between those subtypes over time. So it's not always a fixed thing.
So it's kind of like you're trying to hit a moving target.
That's a good way to put it. You know, it just underscores that SLI is dynamic. It evolves as the child develops.
That makes it even harder to, like, pin down and understand, right?
It does, and it's why it's so important to keep reassessing, keep adapting our approach.
Right, you can't just do a one and done.
Not at all.
Okay, so we talked about what it is, the challenges of classifying it. Now let's get into some possible causes here.
All right, let's dive in.
What are some of the big theories that researchers are working with right now?
Okay, well, remember that puzzle analogy we talked about before? It applies here, too. It's not just one thing.
Okay, so what's one piece of the puzzle that stands out?
Well, I think the role of attention is particularly interesting.
Attention, okay.
Yeah. Could it be that kids with SLI are having trouble paying attention? And that's making it harder to process language?
So if they can't focus on what they're hearing,
it's
going to make learning and using language a lot harder.
Exactly. And there's some research that supports this, you know.
Like what?
Well, Campbell and McNeil, they did this fascinating study where they presented sentences to kids with SLI. But they did it at different speeds.
Interesting.
And they found that when they slowed down the speech, the kids actually understood better.
Oh, wow.
Like, it gave their brains a little extra time to process.
It's like, their brain is just like, whoa, too much, too fast.
Yeah, information overload.
Right, exactly. So that's interesting.
It suggests that limited attention resources might be a key factor here.
Okay, so attention is one piece.
One piece of the puzzle, for sure.
What else are researchers looking at?
Well, another area is auditory processing.
Auditory processing.
Okay.
This one's a little technical.
All right, break it down for me.
Basically, some kids with SLI might have trouble processing sounds that change quickly. Like those rapid transitions between consonants and vowels. So those subtle differences that help us distinguish between words.
Exactly. Think like bat versus pat.
Right.
Those quick changes can be really hard for them to hear.
Interesting.
And Paula Tellal, she's a big name in the field. She proposed this theory linking SLI to this difficulty with rapid sound processing.
Okay.
Now, not everyone agrees with her, but it's definitely sparked a lot of research.
It makes you wonder if there's something different about how those sounds are actually processed in the brain.
That's exactly what they're trying to figure out.
Yeah.
There's so much more to learn about how our brains handle language and how that might be different for people with SLI.
All right, so we've got attention, we've got auditory processing. Are there any other big theories about the causes of SLI we should touch on?
Oh, definitely. We can't forget about phonological representation.
Phonological representation?
And working memory, those are biggies too.
Okay, so phonological representation. First,
yeah, think of that as your brain's, like, mental library of speech sounds.
Okay, so like a catalog of all the sounds that make up words.
Exactly. And if that library isn't organized well, or it's missing some books, it can be really hard to learn new words, pronounce them right, and even understand what others are saying.
So it's like you're trying to build a house, but you're missing some crucial building block.
Exactly. You're going to run into some problems.
Right.
And then there's working memory, which is like your brain's mental workspace.
Working memory, okay.
This is where you hold and manipulate information while you're thinking, learning, you know, all that good stuff.
Okay.
And for language, you need a good working memory to, you know, follow along with complicated sentences.
Right.
Understand grammar rules, even just remember what someone said a few minutes ago.
Yeah, that's important.
Absolutely.
So if that workspace is limited,
oh,
things get difficult.
Yeah, it's like their brain is having to work overtime just to keep up.
So all of this really points to just how complex SLI is.
It's a multifaceted beast.
It's not just one cause. It's this, symphony of different factors all playing together.
Exactly, and we're still figuring out how they all interact.
It's a puzzle in progress, but every piece we find brings us closer to understanding how to really support these individuals.
100%. That's the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
And welcome back to our deep dive into developmental language disorders.
So we're picking up where we left off. We're going to explore some really fascinating insights into what's happening in the brains of people with SLI.
And to do that, we need to talk about neuroimaging.
Okay, neuroimaging, big word.
Yeah, but it's really cool. Techniques like MRI, fMRI, and ERP, those are all giving us this window into how the brain is structured and how it's working, specifically when it comes to language.
So we can actually peek inside and see what's going on.
Exactly. It's like having a backstage pass to the control center of language.
I love that. And we have this amazing chapter by Pavel Lapanin and some other researchers that really dives into these neuroimaging studies. What are some of the things that really jumped out at you?
Well, first of all, it's really important to remember that there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all SLI brain.
Right. Everyone's brain is different.
Exactly. But even with all that variation, researchers are finding these really interesting patterns that might be able to tell us a little bit more about how SLI affects the way people process language.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
All right. So one area that's been a big focus of research is this part of the brain called the temporal lobe. And it plays a really key role in things like auditory processing and understanding language.
Which makes sense, right? We were just talking about how some kids with SLI might have trouble processing those quick changes in sounds.
You got it. And if you're not processing those sounds well, it's going to impact how well you understand language.
That's logical.
Right. Now, within that temporal lobe, there's this specific area called the planum temporale. And that area, oh man, it's like a hub for language processing.
It sounds important.
It is. It's busy analyzing sounds, figuring out what they mean, the whole 9 yards.
So it's like the brain's decoder ring for sounds.
I like that. That's a great way to think about it. And here's the thing. Researchers have found some differences in the planum temporale in people with SLI.
Interesting. So are their planum temporale smaller?
It's not necessarily about size. It seems to be more about how it's organized or even how active it is.
Oh, I see. So it's like the hardware might be similar, but the software is running a different program.
That's a great analogy. Think of it like having two computers with the same processing power, but they're running different operating systems. They're going to perform differently, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. So the planum temporale, that's one area. Are there any other parts of the brain researchers are looking at?
Definitely. The frontal lobe is another big one.
Oh, the frontal lobe, that's like the executive center of the brain, right?
You got it. It's in charge of all those higher level thinking skills like planning, making decisions, and that working memory we were talking about earlier.
Which, as we know, can be tricky for some people with SLI.
Exactly. And some studies suggest that there might be some differences in how active certain parts of the frontal lobe are in folks with SLI, or even how well those different areas are connected to each other.
So maybe the different parts of the brain aren't communicating as effectively.
That's one possibility. And that actually leads us to another really interesting area of research that uses those ERPs we talked about earlier, those brainwave measurements.
Right.
Remember how we were talking about those fast transitions between consonants and vowels?
Yeah, and how that can be tricky for some kids with SLI.
Right. Researchers have been using this really specific ERP response called mismatch negativity, or MM for short.
MMN.
Oh,
okay. That sounds kind of ominous. Huh.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? But think of it like a little alarm bell going off in your brain. So, when we hear a pattern of sounds da-da-da, and then suddenly there's a change da-da-ba, our brain's like, whoa, something's different, and that's the MMN.
So it's like our brain's way of saying, hey, pay attention, this is new.
Exactly. It's a change detection response. Now, here's the interesting part. In some people with SLI, that MMN response, that alarm bell, it can be weaker or slower, especially for those quick sound changes.
So their brains aren't picking up on those subtle differences as quickly.
That's what the research seems to be showing us. And that can make it much harder to learn and understand language. It's like trying to build a puzzle when some of the pieces are missing.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So we've got all this brain research going on. What does it all really tell us about SLI?
I think the biggest takeaway is that SLI is a neurodevelopmental disorder.
Right, so it's not just about trying harder or something.
Exactly. There are actual differences in how the brains of people with SLI are processing and organizing information, especially when it comes to language.
Just like having a different operating system for language, right?
Exactly. And understanding that is huge. It helps us move away from blame and shame and toward a more compassionate and supportive approach.
Absolutely. So how does all this brain research actually impact how we support children with SLI? Does it change our approach to intervention at all?
Oh, definitely. If we know there are these underlying neurological differences, we can start to develop interventions that are more targeted, more effective.
So we can tailor the approach to each child's individual needs.
You got it. Like, if we know a child has trouble with auditory processing, we might focus on strengthening those skills specifically.
Right. So things like maybe breaking sounds down, slowing down how fast we speak, or even using visual cues.
Exactly. It's about figuring out where the child's strengths and weaknesses are and meeting them where they're at. And it also highlights why early intervention is so important. Remember how we talked about how adaptable the brain is in those early years?
Yeah, that plasticity thing.
Right. If we get in there early, we can potentially help those brain pathways develop in a way that's going to support their language development.
It's like giving their brain a clear map to follow.
Love it. And speaking of brain development, there's another fascinating area of research related to SLI that I think is worth mentioning, brain lateralization.
Okay, brain lateralization. I'm going to need you to break that one down for me.
Okay, so it basically refers to the idea that the two halves of your brain, the left and the right hemispheres, they kind of specialize in different things.
Right, like that whole left brain versus right brain idea.
Exactly, but it's usually not as black and white as people make it seem. Anyway, there's some evidence that in some people with SLI, that brain lateralization, that specialization might be a little different when it comes to language.
So the language centers might be organized a bit differently in their brains.
That's the idea. Maybe the language functions are more evenly split between the two sides of the brain, or maybe the right hemisphere is playing a bigger role than usual.
So their brains are finding workarounds, new pathways for language.
Exactly. It shows just how amazing the brain is. It's constantly adapting and finding ways to make things work.
That's incredible. But it also shows how complex SLI really is.
Yeah.
There's no single answer, no one-size-fits-all explanation for how it affects the brain.
You got it. So we've talked a lot about the neuroscience of SLI, but now I think it's time to shift gears a bit and talk about how SLI impacts different areas of language.
Okay, great. We talked about grammar a bit, but what about vocabulary? What about that mental word bank that researchers call the lexicon?
That's where those processing challenges we were talking about earlier, those can really have a lasting impact. Children with SLI, they often have smaller vocabularies than their peers.
That makes sense, right? If you're having trouble processing the sounds of words and holding on to them in your working memory, it's going to be so much harder to build up your vocabulary.
Absolutely. Imagine trying to learn a new language, but all the words just sound like a jumbled mess.
That sounds incredibly frustrating.
It is. And it's not just about the number of words a child knows. It's also about how all those words are organized and connected in their minds.
So it's like having a huge library, but all the books are just thrown in randomly with no system for finding anything.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And then think about verbs. They seem to be particularly difficult for kids with SLI.
Verbs? Why verbs?
Well, verbs are like the action words of language. They tell us what's happening, who's doing it, and when it's happening. And because verbs change depending on the grammar, like walk, walked, walking, that can be really tricky for children who are already having a hard time with processing language rules.
It's like trying to learn dance where the steps keep changing without warning.
Exactly. And struggling with verbs, that can have a domino effect. It can make it harder to understand and put together those longer, more complex sentences.
So it's not just about knowing what the verb means. It's about being able to use it correctly in all these different ways.
You got it. Now, let's step outside of those individual words for a second and talk about pragmatics.
Pragmatics, right?
Yeah.
That's about using language in social situations.
You got it. It's not just about knowing words and grammar rules. It's about understanding things like humor, sarcasm, knowing when to take turns in a conversation, and how to adjust the way you talk depending on who you're talking to and where you are.
So it's like you wouldn't use the same kind of language talking to your best friend as you would talking to your boss.
Exactly. And those social cues can be really subtle, really hard to pick up on for some people with SLI.
And we actually have this chapter by Balkom and Verhoeven that emphasizes how important it is to assess pragmatics alongside all those other language skills. Why do you think that is?
Well, a child might seem like they have pretty good grammar, a decent vocabulary, but they might still be struggling a lot with the social side of communication. Like, they might not get jokes, they might have trouble following conversations, or they might say things that are totally inappropriate for the situation.
Right, and those kinds of communication breakdowns, they can have such a big impact on a child's life.
Huge. It affects friendships, relationships with family, even how they do in school. It's about so much more than just getting the words right.
It's about making connections, building relationships, and just navigating the social world.
You nailed it. And those social communication challenges, those can really take a toll on a child's emotional well-being, too.
Absolutely. If you feel like you're constantly struggling to understand people and to be understood, it's bound to make you feel frustrated, maybe anxious, even withdrawn.
It's like feeling like you're speaking a different language than everyone else.
Exactly. So it's really important to address the emotional side of SLI too, not just the language skills themselves.
Absolutely. It's all connected. And that's actually a perfect segue into what we're going to be talking about in the next part of our deep dive. We're going to explore some of the ways we can support children with SLI, looking at different intervention approaches, how technology can play a role, and how important it is to create a supportive and understanding environment for these kids.
And welcome back to the deep dive. We've been really digging deep into this whole world of developmental language disorders. And now in this last part, I kind of want to step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Some of the challenges we've touched on, like how do you even classify DLD?
Right.
And what are some of the new and exciting intervention approaches? And, where is all this research heading? What does the future hold for our understanding of these, these unique language profiles?
It's really exciting. We've talked about so much, from brain imaging to the social and emotional impacts.
Right.
And now we get to look at what's new in the field.
I love it. Okay, so one thing that keeps popping up in our research is this idea that classifying DLD is hard.
It's tough. It's not like you can just check a box and say, okay, you have this.
Well, it's not black and white. It's not a simple yes or no.
It's a spectrum for sure.
Right, exactly.
Even within those subtypes we talked about, there's so much variation.
And I know Dorothy Bishop in one of her chapters really digs into this problem.
Oh, she does.
She talks about how those traditional ways of diagnosing DLD, like relying on that difference between IQ and language skills.
The discrepancy.
Right, the discrepancy. She's saying maybe that's not really painting the whole picture.
It's missing something.
It's too simplistic.
And Conti Ramsden, too, she points out how even those more detailed systems, like Rapin and Allen's classification, they're still hard to use sometimes, because kids can shift between those categories.
Right, exactly.
It's a moving target, like we were saying.
So if these traditional ways of classifying DLD aren't quite working, what are researchers doing about it? What are some of the alternatives they're exploring?
Well, Bishop, she suggests that maybe we should shift our focus a little.
Okay, how so?
Instead of getting so caught up in these rigid categories, she says we should try to understand those underlying processes that are causing the language difficulties.
So it's more about understanding the why, not just slapping a label on it.
Right. So what's making it hard for this child to process language?
Okay, so we're looking at each kid as an individual.
Absolutely.
Not just as a category or a subtype.
And that helps you tailor your interventions too, right?
It's like you're addressing the root cause, not just the symptoms.
You got it.
Okay, so that brings us to interventions.
Yeah.
There's so much exciting stuff happening in that area.
So much. It's really cool to see.
One thing that I'm really seeing take off is technology.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we talked about programs like Fast Forward, but there are all these apps and software programs popping up.
And they're making it fun for kids.
They are.
It's not like sitting down with flashcards anymore.
Right.
It's like you're playing a game and learning at the same time.
I've seen some that use virtual rewards and stuff.
Yeah, they get points, they level up.
It keeps them engaged.
And it works.
And it's not just limited to apps and computer programs.
Oh, no way.
There's this whole thing with virtual reality now.
VR is huge, and for good reason.
I mean, this sounds so cool. How is that being used?
Well, imagine a kid with DLD who can practice their social skills in a virtual world.
Oh, wow.
They can try out different scenarios like ordering food at a restaurant or asking for help at a store, but they can do it without the pressure of a real-life interaction.
It's like a safe space to practice.
Exactly. It takes the anxiety out of it.
And as the technology keeps getting better, I can only imagine what we'll be able to do.
It's limitless, really.
One of the sources even mentioned, like brain-computer interfaces.
BCIs.
Yeah, BCIs. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
I know, right. But they're becoming a reality.
Yeah, pretty wild.
It is. So they basically allow researchers to measure brain activity in real time.
Okay.
And then they can use that information to, like, give feedback. Or even control devices.
So theoretically, you could use this technology to help a child with DLD. Maybe improve their attention or their auditory processing.
That's the hope.
It's still early, but the potential is huge.
It's groundbreaking stuff.
It really is. It makes you wonder, like, what other breakthroughs are just around the corner?
And that's what I love about this field. It's always moving forward.
It is. And it brings us back to this, central question of understanding DLD, right?
Absolutely.
There's still so much we don't know, but the research is happening, and it's happening fast.
And that's giving us hope for more effective and personalized support for these individuals.
It's about recognizing that DLD isn't a deficit.
Right.
It's just a difference.
It's part of who they are.
Exactly. It's about embracing neurodiversity.
And making sure everyone's communication style is valued and supported.
That's a great message to end on. And as we wrap up this deep dive into developmental language disorders, I want to leave our listeners with this thought.
Okay.
Given all the advances in research and technology we've talked about today, what if we could create a truly personalized learning path for every child with DLD?
That's the dream, right?
It is tailored to their specific strengths and challenges.
Reading their unique needs.
Exactly. Think about what we could unlock if we could do that.
The possibilities are endless. It's really inspiring.
It is, and that's what I love about this world.
And me too.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Into the world of developmental language disorders. We hope you learned something. And that you're walking away feeling inspired and maybe even a little bit hopeful about the future of this field.
Absolutely.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.